Okay team, what's our next video going to be?
Maybe another gym leader video?
Probably not, we just did one. Maybe a little video of me? I mean, always a great choice, but I was hoping for something to do with Pokemon. What about the worst Gen 7 Pokemon? Not a bad idea, but I feel like we just did one of those. Shep, it's been like 7 months. What? Generation 7 is such a refreshing take on the mainline Pokemon games. Casting away the gym leader formula for trials and kahunas was such a fun choice, and having 4 islands to explore really made the region feel dynamic. Not to mention the story, which is so much better than I remember it being. There's a ton of great dialogue I often forget about, and it's actually quite intense at moments. You know, for Pokemon. And of course, who can forget the many new additions to the Pokédex? Actually, I'm guessing quite a lot of you. When's the last time you thought about Delmise? You should. It's awesome. Alola had a really interesting roster of Pokemon. Some were immediately thrust into the spotlight, like the new beloved starter trio or the Tapus and Ultra Beasts that dominated competitive. Then of course there were some new fan favorites, like Mimikyu, Beware, and Salazzle, just to name a few. And then there are some that I just never hear people talk about, like what do y'all think of Silvally?
How about this one? I call it bold and brash. More like belongs in the trash!
But today, we're only worried about one kind of Pokemon. The worst ones. The goal of this series is to highlight the worst Pokemon for an in-game playthrough. A Pokemon can be considered the worst for a variety of reasons, like the ones listed on screen. Instead of just focusing on something like base stats, I want to highlight any number of reasons a Pokemon is subpar for a playthrough, like a limited move pool, annoying encounter method, or even just an ugly-ass back sprite. In addition, I'm also going to avoid any version-exclusive Pokemon, as you can always argue a Pokemon is worth using because of its exclusivity. And besides, none of the version exclusives would have made the list anyways, outside of maybe the 2 Ice-type regional variants. They're only available before the Elite Four, but even then they're decent Pokemon to pick up before the final fights, which is more than I can say for other Pokemon. Lastly, keep in mind that something being considered the worst doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. By this point in the franchise, Pokemon have tons of tools at their disposal to make them better. Level up movesets are more dialed in, there's reusable TMs, and even Pokemon Refresh, which over time can increase the likelihood for your Pokemon to live certain attacks that they really shouldn't. With all these available resources, even mediocre Pokemon can end up getting you through the game. All this is to say, worst doesn't automatically mean bad. As I've said before, the worst performing Pokemon in the OU tier are still in the OU tier. Oh, also, this playthrough is being done on Pokémon Sun, to keep with my theme of playing the gen's original releases. While I could have played through Ultra Sun, I also don't hate myself. These games are already hard enough without an Ultra Necrozma laughing in your face. But if you'd like to do this playthrough in the sequels, be my guest. Anyways, that pretty much covers it, so drop a like, subscribe, and let's jump into the worst Gen 7 Pokemon. To kick us off, let's take a trip back in time to August 2016. The Pokemon World Championships are taking place, and to get everyone excited for the new main series titles, Game Freak revealed a few brand new Pokemon coming in Sun and Moon. This included Stuffle, the adorable bear cub, Sandygast and Palosand, the ghost and ground type sandcastles, and our very first Pokemon of discussion, the boxing Pokemon, Crabrawler. I normally focus on a Pokemon's final stage in these videos, but you'll see pretty soon why we're focusing on Brawler and not Abominable. Now at first glance, Crabrawler isn't a Pokemon that looks super strong. Sure, it's got big old boxing gloves for hands, but most people wouldn't look at this thing and think metagame defining threat. Unless Game Freak shows you a video of it knocking out Pokemon like Ferrothorn, Talonflame, Cresselia, and Landorus Therian, which at the time was arguably the most influential Pokemon in all of competitive. So naturally, after watching this little crab destroy some of the metagame's best, many of us assumed it would be one of the generation's best. And well, let's just say, holy shit did they lie to us. Looking at its stats, Crabrawler really isn't too bad for a first stage Pokemon. In fact, for the early game, 82 base attack is quite impressive. And I do mean early game, because you can catch it before completing a single trial. Crabrawler is the only Pokemon in Sun and Moon that's encountered through berry piles. There's a number of these scattered throughout the region, and anytime you go up to collect berries, there's a chance Crabrawler will jump out at you. These piles refresh every day, but since you can just soft reset until a pile contains a Crabrawler, it's quite easy to obtain. And if you are able to get one early, you'll breeze right through the normal trial, especially because you can pick up the TM for Brick Break during the trial. Like I said, these games give you a lot of helpful tools. So between its decent early game stats, availability, and potential to decimate the first trial, why is it on the list? Well, this is where we need to talk about its evolution, Crabominable. An ice fighting type, Crabominable has amazing dual stab and a ridiculously high 132 base attack. The only problem is, you won't be seeing it for a long time. As of Generation 9, you evolve Crabrawler by giving it an Ice Stone, which isn't too hard to find. But since we're in Gen 7, it can only evolve by leveling up on a route with snow. And the only snowy area in all of Alola is Mount Lanakila, which you can only get to right before the Elite Four. Considering that your final Gladion fight is the first battle Crabrawler can evolve from, that leaves Crabominable with a whopping 6 battles. How, the Elite Four, and the Champion. And between those 6 battles, there's quite a few Pokemon the Crab does not want to go up against. While it does have a few good matchups in these fights, for one, you could basically have anything else by this point, and two, this doesn't make up for the fact that you're stuck with Crabrawler for everything before this point. And while its stats may be fine for the early game, as you start facing stronger and stronger Pokemon, Crabrawler turns into a Crabballer. That's baller like crying, by the way, not like basketball. It's at peak performance during the normal trial thanks to Brick Break, which is also your best move until close combat at level 49, and from there it's just a constant decline. It doesn't do good against any future totems, it's not great for many boss fights, and most importantly, it can barely survive a hit from anything in the late game. You're almost required to run Eviolite on it to have a chance of surviving most hits, and even then you're not surviving them well. Again, Crabominable isn't terrible for the last few fights, but you might as well use Beware if you want a good fighting type. Sorry if I sound a bit annoyed, this Pokemon just makes me a bit crabby. Next on the list is a Pokemon I really want to call good because it has a lot going for it, but the negatives drag it down just far enough to be on this list. The illuminating Pokemon, Shiinotic. Let me start by mentioning all of its positives. Shiinotic's pre-evolution Morelull is quite easy to come across, with Brooklet Hill being its earliest location. And unlike an Ultra Sun and Moon, in the base games you can catch it before completing the water trial. As for its typing, while Grass Fairy isn't the best combo out there, it's nowhere near a bad one, as it sports a number of helpful resistances like Fighting, Ground, and Dark, just to name a few. Not to mention, Shiinotic gets some amazing moves by level up like Moonblast, Strength Sap, and most importantly, Spore. And with an early evolution level of 24, you don't have to sit with its pre-evolved form for very long. I'm looking at you stupid crab. On the surface, Shiinotic doesn't seem like it'd be a bad team member, but once you start looking a little bit deeper, the cracks start to show. For one, while it does get access to those great moves I mentioned, it's going to be a hot minute before you can learn any of them. Until then, you'll be relying on Mega Drain and Astonish for damage, and Sleep Powder and Confuse Ray for status moves, which can make for some annoyingly long fights in the early game. Especially if you're still a Morelull. Not to mention, this line gets pitiful coverage. Outside of Grass and Fairy Stab, its only notable attacks are Sludge Bomb and Dream Eater. And even if you were to use these, it's not like they're dealing a ton of damage. Shiinotic's stats aren't terrible, but I also wouldn't call them good. 100 in Spadef may seem nice, but with only 60 in HP, it's actually quite average. There were plenty of times I expected Shiinotic to tank a hit pretty well, only for it to do way more damage than I expected. And like I said, with only 90 in special attack, your attacks aren't weak, but they're also not strong. And with an awful 30 base speed, you're almost always going second. As for an ability, Illuminate is one of the few that's often worse than having no ability. However, its other ability, Effect Spore, can also majorly backfire. Let's say you want to use Spore on something, but since you have terrible speed, your opponent goes first and hits you with an attack. That attack triggers Effect Spore and boom! They get paralyzed, meaning Spore was a complete waste. Now I know this is situational, and Illuminate is still far worse, but getting countered by your own ability is ridiculously frustrating, and in some cases could end up costing you the fight. Also, while I stand by my comment that Grass Fairy isn't a bad type, you're still going to come across plenty of Pokemon with a super effective move for you. Especially Poison, because for some reason, a ton of Pokemon are packing a random Poison move, and with your 4x weakness, well... What really gets to me about Shiinotic is that it's so close to being good. If it was a little more defensive, or had a little more special attack, or a little more coverage, or a little better of an ability, or a little more of everything, it would be pretty good. In short, let's just say there's much room for improvement. Next, I'd like to bring up a quick honorable mention. The small fry Pokemon, Wishy-washy. Wishy-washy, wish. Like some of you out there, I wasn't sure how good it was going to be given its main gimmick, schooling. Once Wishy-washy hits level 20, its ability allows it to transform into school form, where it gains a massive stat boost in everything but HP and speed. The only catch is that it reverts back to solo form if its HP falls below 25%. As someone who's never used it in-game, I wasn't sure if this ability would be annoying to play around with, so I decided to pick one up just to see how it did. And holy shit, this thing is broken. You tank hits like a beast once you're transformed, plus you can get the Scald TM within moments of catching it in Brooklet Hill, making it even more busted. No joke, despite having a grass type in my party, Wishy-washy was the only reason I got past the water trial, which was against another Wishy-washy. Plus it easily solos the fire trial as well. I might even go as far as to say it's one of the best water types in Sun and Moon. So why am I even bringing it up? Well, anytime in the future I say something you think is wrong, or simply don't agree with, keep in mind I'm also a dude who debated calling Wishy-washy one of the worst Gen 7 Pokemon, so take everything I say with a mountain of salt. If you thought almost putting Wishy-washy on the list was bad, there's gonna be rioting in the streets for this next one. The brutal star Pokemon, Toxapex. Okay, before you rush to the comments to tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, hear me out. I am very, very aware that Toxapex is one of the best and most annoying Pokemon in competitive history. Plenty of y'all made a fuss when it didn't make the Poison Gym Leader team, and I'm sure plenty of y'all feel similarly now. And honestly, I can't say I blame you. With its ludicrous stats, amazing defensive typing, and utility moves like Baneful Bunker, Toxic Spikes, and Recover, it's easily the best Pokemon on this entire list. Plus, you can even get one with its hidden ability Regenerator if you're lucky enough. But despite all of that, I have 3 big problems with it. First, its encounter method. Out of every new Pokemon in Sun and Moon, Toxapex, or more specifically Mareanie, has the weirdest encounter method by far. You'll never just come across it in the wild. Instead, you need to find it through something new to Gen 7, SOS battles. Only in Alola, Pokemon have a chance to call for help at the end of a turn. If the call is successful, another wild Pokemon will join the battle, changing it from a one-on-one to a one-on-two. This is the feature that allows Totem Pokemon to call for an ally during your trials, and it's also the only way to encounter a wild Mareanie. But it doesn't stop there, as not any Pokemon can call a Mareanie into battle. No, Mareanie can only show up as an SOS ally for one Pokemon, Corsola. Now admittedly, this isn't a crazy thing to make happen. It's not nearly as annoying as Honey Trees from Gen 4, and not even close to the Feebas Hell from the Hoenn games. Plus, by the time Sun and Moon came out, so many resources were out there telling you how and where to catch certain Pokemon. Otherwise, we'd still be figuring out how to evolve Inkay. But that said, unless you're looking up specifically where to get it, it's very unlikely you're going to come across a Mareanie naturally. Corsola itself isn't even a Pokemon you're guaranteed to find. And even if you do, there's no guarantee Marienie's gonna show up quickly anyways. But I hear you, that's not necessarily enough to call it one of the worst. So let's get to the second issue, its playstyle. We're all used to Toxapex being an amazing defensive pivot in competitive singles, but in-game playthroughs don't really work the same way. Sure, you can sit there and Toxic Stall a trainer's Pokemon, but for one, that's going to take up so much of your time, and 2, you'd have to do that a few hundred times to get through the game. Also, since you're not maxing out defensive EVs in-game, it's not even that amazing at tanking hits in actuality. So unless you want to waste several hours of your life Toxic Stalling NPCs, you're probably going to use some attacking moves, with offensive stats worse than unknown. And if you really wanted a water type that can both tank some hits and dish out damage, you might as well use, I don't know, Wishy-washy. Plus, I haven't even mentioned the fact that Toxapex evolves at level 38. So instead of these stats, you're spending a lot of time with Mareanie, which is nowhere near as bulky as its evolution. Sure, you can give it Eviolite, but it still pales in comparison to Toxapex. And again, is it really worth it to spend 8 turns stalling out a Pokemon when another one could KO it in 2? But hey, let's say you don't care about its encounter method, or its high evolution level, or even its passive playstyle. There's still one big issue, and that's your moveset. Toxapex very quickly runs into the issue we call the 4 move slot syndrome. it simultaneously wants to remove like Toxic, Scald, Recover, Toxic Spikes, Venoshock, and Baneful Bunker, not to mention a few TM moves as well. But even if we look at just these 6, you're going to miss out on something. Toxic is super helpful for Totem Pokemon and others that can't be hit by T-Spikes, Scald is necessary so Steel types don't wall you, Venoshock is a godsend for helping move battles along, Recover and Baneful Bunker are needed to utilize your defensive prowess, and Toxic Spikes are amazing during the final fights of the game. And since the move relearner is stuck on top of Mount Lanakila, if you get rid of a move too early, oh well, suffer. Look, in all seriousness, I'm not telling you to not get Toxapex in-game. I love using Pokemon I never have before, and you don't need to go full Toxic Stall to use it effectively. But also, is this really the battle you want? Okay, with all that said, now you can rush to the comments to tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. From defensive water type to defensive water type, next on the list is the sea cucumber Pokemon, Pyukumuku. Of every Pokemon from every worst gen video so far, Pyukumuku is really weird to talk about. For those unaware, Pyukumuku's whole gimmick is that it can't learn any attacking moves. Well, outside of Bite and Counter, but those barely count. Its strategy is centered on taking hits, countering back the damage, using Toxic, and stalling with Recover. After everything I just said about Toxapex, I don't think I need to explain why this isn't the best strategy for in-game. Instead, I'd rather talk about a few of its shortcomings by bringing up another Pokemon, Wobbuffet. Adopting a similar no-attack playstyle, Wobbuffet uses Counter and Mirror Coat to deal tons of damage back to the opponent once it gets hit. The reason this works for Wobbuffet is because it has high HP and low defenses. Because of this, it loses a lot of HP when hit, which allows Counter and Mirror Coat to deal a ton of damage back. Now looking at Pyukumuku's stats, I think you'll see the problem. Having low HP and high defenses is kind of the opposite of what we want. Pyukumuku ends up taking little damage because it has high defenses, meaning Counter doesn't do that much back. Not to mention, it only gets Counter, not Mirror Coat, so if it's a special attacker... And while Toxic and Recover are a nice alternative to Counter, you won't get these moves for quite some time. Thus, much of the early game with Pyukumuku is spent waiting for opportunities to use Counter. And sometimes, even if there is a physical attacker on screen, there's no guarantee it's going to go smoothly. Now you might be thinking,
Shep, is it really fair to put Pyukumuku on this list given how gimmicky it is?
while part of me wanted to give it a pass due to its circumstances, it's not so unusable that it can't do well in game, especially because of its ability Innards Out, which deals damage to an opponent equal to the amount of HP it had left before getting knocked out. It's a really weird ability to say out loud, but hopefully the footage makes it clear. Despite how specifically it's meant to function, Pyukumuku still came in clutch for me a number of times. I mean, hell, it's the only reason I was able to take down Totem Vikavolt. And looking at my team up to this point, yeah, nothing else stood a chance against it. I know it sounds like I'm praising Pyukumuku more than condemning it, but don't get it twisted, I still don't recommend using it outside of self-imposed challenge. Despite having a few good matches, there were still plenty of fights where it did nothing more than take up a slot on my team. You're still better off going with something that, oh, I don't know, has attacking moves? But do you want to know the worst part of all? I would still use it over f***ing Crabrawler. After spending so much time on water types, I'm happy to finally lay them to rest. That pun will make more sense in a second. Next we have the posy picker Pokemon, Comfey. Jumping straight into stats, Comfey is quite similar to our other fairy type, Shiinotic, albeit a bit weaker, a little bulkier, and a hell of a lot faster. Which reminds me, it was hard to fit this in earlier, but do you want to know one of the worst things about all of our previous team members? None of them could run away from a wild encounter. To grossly simplify escaping wild encounters, the slower you are, the harder it is to run. Meaning all these slow f***s could almost never run away. Do you know how annoying it is to click the run button 5 times in a row and still be stuck in battle? What the f***? So yeah, needless to say, Comfey having high speed is pretty nice. But unfortunately, high speed isn't enough to keep you off this list. Anyways, the first big issue for Comfey is actually obtaining it. It's only available in Lush Jungle at a 5% encounter rate. Because this is where the grass trial takes place, you need to come back after the trial to catch one. This isn't too much of a headache, as 5% is much better than the days of 1% from previous gens, but there's another big issue when it comes to its encounter. Comfey can be found anywhere from level 18 to 21. Whenever a wild Pokemon is encountered, it'll have its 4 most recent level up moves. If we look at Comfey's level up moveset, it'll always have Magical Leaf, Growth, and Wrap when encountered. If it's level 19 and above, it has Sweet Kiss. and only level 18 Comfeys have Draining Kiss. This is a really important move for Comfey, as it's not only a stab move that heals it, it's the only stab move it gets until Play Rough at level 49, or until you get the TM for Dazzling Gleam in Vast Pony Canyon, which is ridiculously far into the game. And again, since the move reminder is on Mount Lanakila, unless you catch one at level 18, you have no fairy stab for the majority of the game. Funny enough, it's even worse for Ultra Sun and Moon, because they changed its encounter in Lush Jungle to only be between levels 19 and 21. Outstanding move, Game Freak. Without Draining Kiss, you're stuck with grass attacks and Wrap for most of the game. And quick reminder, these are the stats you're working with, so yeah, those moves aren't going to do much damage. What's really unfortunate is that Draining Kiss pairs beautifully with its ability Triage, which gives priority to any healing move it uses. Funny enough, since it also learned Synthesis, Comfey was actually a great partner for Toxic Stalling with Toxapex. But again, if that's your strategy for an in-game playthrough, you might want to play something else. I can't speak to how good Comfey would be with Draining Kiss, but I don't think it's enough to make up for how underwhelming it is overall. Similar to Shiinotic, it doesn't take hits as well as you think it does, and it doesn't dish out nearly as much damage as you hope it would. No joke, there were plenty of fights where Wrap was my best damage dealing option solely because of the damage over time effect. And if Wrap is your best strategy, unless you're in Gen 1, oof. It does get better once it learns Dazzling Gleam, but Comfey as a Pokemon is built so heavily for support that it just doesn't quite cut it for singles. Not to mention, despite having 100 base speed, it still isn't that fast. I know that a lot of what I'm saying depends on you not having Draining Kiss on Comfey, but honestly, even with it, I don't think it's worth it. And again, in the Ultra games, you don't even have the chance to get it. You also miss out on Leech Seed either way, which isn't as relevant, but it's still a slap in the face. I guess what I'm trying to say is, pass on picking the pedal-powered Posy Picker Pokemon, please. Of course, no worse gen list is complete without a Pikachu clone, and this time we have the roly-poly Pokemon, Togedemaru. Now fortunately, I can say something positive. Of every Pikachu clone to date, it's probably the best. Being part Steel type is a big reason for this, as it gets an insane amount of resistances. While this doesn't necessarily make up for its low defenses, Togedemaru can still take a hit, maybe two before going down. Plus, with a decent speed stat, it can usually go first and annoy the opponent with an electric move, or an electric move, or an electric move. Ah, yeah, I'm starting to remember why it's on the list. While it can get a couple of coverage moves through TM, Togedemaru is basically spamming electric attacks the whole game. Granted, it does get some useful ones like Nuzzle to paralyze and Zing Zap to flinch, but if you don't need a Pokemon to use an electric move, there's kind of no point in using Togedemaru. And while some of you might be thinking, what about Ironhead? It actually doesn't get Ironhead until Ultra Sun and Moon through a move tutor, meaning your only steel attack in the base game is Gyro Ball. Not really great for a faster Pokemon that wants to paralyze things. It does have other things going for it, like Iron Barbs for an ability to deal passive damage, Spiky Shield to basically do the same thing, and by the end of the game you could even try to have fun with Fell Stinger. But all in all, it's just lackluster. Even on my team of total misfits, where its typing was very appreciated amongst the sea of water and fairy types, it was nowhere near one of my best. But despite all of this, what disappoints me most about Togedemaru is that it pales in comparison to the original electric steel type, Magnemite. You aren't able to catch Togedemaru until Blush Mountain, which is on Ula Ula Island. Meanwhile, Magnemite can be caught as early as the Trainer School. As I said, Steel has a ton of resistances, and having a Steel Pokemon in the early game is nothing short of spectacular due to all the tackles and scratches being thrown your way. By the time you get to Blush Mountain where you can catch Togedemaru, Magnemite is basically ready to evolve into Magneton if it hasn't already. And while it may not be as fast, its high special attack and solid bulk more than make up for it, especially since it can still hold in a Violite as a Magneton. And the cherry on top, if you are playing Ultra Sun and Moon, guess where you need to go to evolve Magneton into Magnezone? Blush Mountain. So let me ask you this, would you rather use an Eviolite Magneton, Magnezone, or Togedemaru? Again, it's not unusable, but I think it's a safe bet to call it one of the worst Pokemon in the entire generation. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed, and let me know what you think the worst Gen 7 Pokemon are in the comments. I promise the Gen 8 video won't take 7.5 months to get out. Maybe only 6.5. Anyways, as thanks for making it to the end of the video, here's a picture of my dog. Talk to y'all soon.